the roof seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.
And I listen to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast.
Indeed you are, people. You listen to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. And for those of you listening on YouTube, yes, you can already see that the band is back together. The NWO Wolfpack, the NWO Black and White. The band is back together, people. Santokie has returned from his 80 days around the world. And we're here to do what we do best. Look at issues around the Caribbean, around West Indies cricket, and critique it and try and understand it and, discuss it with you, the people. Get at us in the comments below as usual, based on whatever you think about what we're saying. At us at Carib Cricket, whether Twitter or Instagram. Find us on Facebook, Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Head to our website, www.caribbeancricketpodcast.com. Buy a Caribbean Cricket Podcast cap. What else have I missed? Become a patron of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. All of that jazz, people. And most importantly of all, like, share, subscribe, review, rate, etc. That's all the admin out of the way. Santokie, how you doing?
Yeah, well, good, Mash. And, supporting West Indies is stressful. I needed those 80 days, to mentally reset, recharge ahead of a busy schedule. World Cup qualifiers coming up, India Tour, CPL, all coming up in the next few months. But before that, Mash, we've got an important tri-series coming up, which we're going to talk about. But also, shout out to Machel, hardest working man in the Caribbean media. I've been putting up those videos, cool and smooth. And also, for those of you who thought he was joking when he said he was going to be a West Indies selector, he started the groundwork, scouting Kimar Roach at Surrey Cricket Ground in London, so getting that work in. But yeah, Mash, we're here to talk about, it's starting tomorrow as of recording, the Headley Weeks Tri-Series Red Ball tournament in the region, which is the first of its kind. Now, to give some context for those of you who are unaware of what it is, it's essentially a Tri-Series tournament made up of 3 teams, one being the West Indies Academy team, and then 2 teams, Team Headley and Team Weeks, respectively, being made up from the star performers of the recently concluded domestic season. Now, I think Cricket West Indies have done this, obviously, with the domestic season being, once again, only 5 games instead of 10. This is sort of an avenue to make that up and have players play more first-class cricket. Now, Machel, before we get into the sides and the composition and the criteria and all that kind of stuff, I think, firstly, my main thought when this was announced was, so you've got 3 teams, the West Indies Academy teams and 2 teams made up of senior players. For me personally, Mash, I don't know if you agree or disagree, I would have thought it would have been more logical to have 3 teams which mixed up the academy players with the senior players, especially if you're looking to have a tournament which might lead to test recalls or players making test claims. For me, having 2 teams of senior players face off against an academy side, it almost seems more like an exhibition sort of tri-series rather than a serious competitive one. So just to get started, what are your thoughts on the format? Do you think it's the right format? Would you have adjusted it?
Okay, with the academy side, I get it. I think it's fair to say that we understand the notion of why you just have an academy side, because this side now, or these young men within the cohort of the academy side, have been there for the best part of coming up to a year almost, right? In and out, dipping in and out, doing bits and pieces. They played together or as a team during the Super 50, etc. Where I agree with you, and it remains to be seen, because for all we know, the academy team might beat one of these Headley Week sides. And I say this with the best will in the world, that would be a bit of an embarrassment if that happens, right? In the same way how when the academy side beat the Scorpions in Super 50 in the early stages, that was a bit of an embarrassment, right? So I get your point. But I also understand why they can't do that, because the academy is supposed to be a team that's kept all together. I think are you saying though that it would have been better to have 3 teams? Unless your point is that it would be better to have 3 teams and you just feed in some of the academy players.
So, yeah, my thing would be you have 3 teams, and within those teams you have 3 to 4 academy players. So you're still getting the 11 players mixed up with teams, because my logic is I get you want to promote the academy team, but for instance, okay, say you're a McKennie Clark and you're bowling against Tajanara and Chanderpaul's 150 or 300 balls. You're looking around. Well, who's going to support you? You've got fellow academy players, and likewise, if you're a Keegan Simmons and you're opening, I just feel it would have been more beneficial to be partnered with a senior player like a Tajanara and Chanderpaul just to learn. So for me, I mean, as you said, the academy side could surprise us and win one of the matches or perform well. But for me, if you're looking to develop the academy players, I just feel it would have been better to mix them with the senior players. And likewise, if you're a Tajanara and Chanderpaul, okay, let's say you're a Darren Bravo, you're using these first-class games to stake a claim to get back into the test side. How serious is that going to be if you scored a century against the academy side? Is it going to be consideration? So I don't see the benefit necessarily to the academy players. I don't know what they might necessarily learn. They'll obviously learn a lot. It'll be a steep learning curve, but they won't be able to play alongside senior players that experience to learn. And for the senior players, you know, Josh Da Silva, Tajanara and Chanderpaul, Darren Bravo, Kieran Powell, I don't necessarily see what the benefits are of them facing off against an academy side. It's fine if you're saying it's an exhibition series, then that's fine. But if you're saying these are first-class games, which could lead to sort of test selections, then I just don't see how this format sort of works.
Yeah, the better bet, and obviously I'm fairly certain that finances and logistics would have come into it, but the better bet would have been, and I think, remember when we had Jimmy Adams on the podcast a while back, and I think Jimmy kind of intimated to us that they were looking at this is before we even knew about how the West Indies Championship was going to work this year. He kind of intimated to us last year that they're looking at how to include the academy in more of the domestic competitions, right? I would have preferred that the academy team just play as a team throughout the whole of the 5-round competition. And if they took licks, they took licks. But I think that would have been more preferable to give them greater exposure. And then you have your 3 teams. So you can't call it Headley Weeks then. You have to call it like Headley Weeks, Walcott or something like that, whatever it might be, yeah? And then you have your 3 teams at the end, and if some academy players get in, or like you make a rule where it's like every team has to have at least 3 academy players or whatever it might be, right? So I do think in hindsight there's a bit of a flawed element, logistics notwithstanding, to how they could have gone about this. But even more so, before we get into who was selected and the this, that, and the whatever, my actual issue is this. There were players within this year's West Indies Championship who fit the age criteria for the academy, but because they're not in the academy, they aren't playing for the academy. So, for example, let me give you 2 obvious names. Matthew Nandu didn't get in Team Headley or Team Weeks, and I'm fine with that. I think there was a case to argue that he should have done, but I'm fine with him not getting in there. But given Matthew Nandu is only 19 years old, and I know he wasn't in the academy cohort to begin with, so I get the rationale that would be given to say, well, boy, he wasn't part of the academy to begin with. I think Matthew lives in Canada anyway, and so on and so forth. But if we're not going to use Nandu, we could use a Kamani Melius, who's only, 21, 22, 23, or whatever it might be. He's another one who technically fits that academy remit. He's not in the academy side. So what were we saying to a Nandu and a Melius then? Have we halted their potential growth by not being a bit more, what's the word I should use here, Santokie? By not being a bit more flexible in how we were picking these squads?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think if you're saying this tri-series is an opportunity for academy players to develop, I don't see why you wouldn't have included a Nandu and a Melius. Bearing in mind, as you said, they hit the right age criteria and their performances. I mean, it can be argued that obviously Melius got injured, so he didn't play the full season. Nandu dropped off in their performances. But the fact that Melius hit the highest individual score in the season, Nandu did have some consistency with some big scores in the first few games for Guyana. I think they should have been given an opportunity. And also, again, in hindsight, in the last hour or so, it's been announced that Tevin Imlach who's obviously not part of the academy. He's been part of the Guyana senior side. He's been added to the academy side as a replacement for Rivaldo Clark. So if the criteria from the academy side are being bended now, there was always an opportunity to include Anandu and Amelia. So it is baffling in terms of why they've excluded those two players, because you just think it's to the detriment of West Indies cricket as a whole not to include them.
And then let's pivot to the well, what was initially, well, not even initially, this was the criteria as I understood it before the tournament started, right? And when I say before the tournament, I mean the actual West Indies Championship. Cricket West Indies put out a press release essentially saying at the end of the 5 rounds of the West Indies Championship, we will hold a Headley Weeks series, Team Headley, Team Weeks, and the West Indies Academy, and the best players from the West Indies Championship will be selected to go forward. And they also included the line, and it will also be an opportunity for players who aren't part of the current Test 11 to also play. And the kind of implied nature of that last line was you're looking like at somebody like a Brandon King, who may have had white ball commitments, who, because of West Indies white ball commitments, wouldn't have had time to play in the 4-day champ in the Caribbean. So therefore, people read that line as meaning, oh, right, so some of our white ball players who don't get the opportunity to play in the rounds because of West Indies duty, there's also the option for them to get kind of shunted into this kind of best versus best scenario, so people can cast a look over them to see if they are ready for red ball cricket and so on and so forth. What I didn't see in that press release, Santokie, and what took me by surprise is I was under the impression that current test players wouldn't be included. So when you were away, I did a video with my Team Headley versus Team Weeks, right? In my Team Headley Team Weeks squads that I picked, I had no current test players in it because I had assumed, well, they're not playing because what's the point of them playing? If you see what I mean, what's the point of them taking up somebody else's spot when I assume that Team Headley Team Weeks was essentially giving us an opportunity to look at all of the quote-unquote best players who aren't currently in any kind of contention for Test cricket. So the question I put to you then is, do you think we've done the right thing? And by we, I mean Cricket West Indies. Do you think they've done the right thing by including like your Tej Chandapals, your Raymond Reefers, who else has got to look in, your Josh De Silvas, your Devon Thomases, etc.? Do you think they've done the right thing by including players in the Test 11 who aren't at the IPL, and therefore limited the number of places available for the rest of the players who played the majority of the West Indies Championship?
You know what? That's a very good question. I think there's two sides to the coin, because one, you could say they're taking places of the regional performers who should have warranted a spot in this Tri-Series tournament. But on the other hand, you can say, how are you going to judge someone's criteria, judge someone's skill set to make the Test side if they're not playing against Test players? So if you've got Tej Chandapal, a Moti playing in this tournament, you essentially have something to gauge it on, a metric as to the quality of the competition. But again, this leads to the flaws of, if Tej Chandapal, De Silva, Moti are playing, why aren't the likes of Blackwood, Roston Chase taking part either? Because you'd think it'd be Tej Chandapal is going to play against India. He's going to open against India based on his performances. Players like Blackwood and Chase, where there are question marks, you would assume this would have been a perfect opportunity for them to, hit big scores, get their confidence back, show selectors they are in form. So it'd be interesting to know did these players volunteer? The Test players volunteer to take part in this tournament? Were some given the option to rest? Did some decline? So I think that's all confusion as well. But I do think having a scattering of Test players in this series does add some credibility to it. But it's just with a lot of things with West Indies cricket, there's just no clarity in sort of the process or thinking behind it, because we've essentially got some Test players in it, and then the ones who you like Blackwood or Chase, who you'd imagine would benefit more so from taking part, aren't in it. So how did that come about? Basically, that's sort of the clarity which is missing from this.
Yeah, and actually, I'm just reading the press release after the squads were named. So I'll just read this paragraph. The two teams have been drawn from the leading performers in the 2023 West Indies Championship and those deemed to be on the fringes of the Test team. Additionally, Cricket West Indies named the teams to provide further first-class opportunities to the best performers from the West Indies Championship in a competitive and intense setting, as well as opportunities for players who the selectors believe would benefit from playing red ball cricket as West Indies prepare for the upcoming A-team tour of Bangladesh and the 2 Test series against India at home. Now, based on that statement, okay, fine, you could argue there's a rationale there. They want to give some red ball prep time ahead of that India series in July. My only concern is that India series is literally 3 months away, right? So I'm not saying that Tage doesn't need the red ball prep. I'm not saying Raymond Reefer doesn't need the red ball prep. But as you said, so what? What are we saying then? Are Blackwood and Chase getting dropped? Because how comes they're not? No, but seriously, it's a reasonable question because how comes they're not included then? And also, if there is going to be an 18 tour to Bangladesh, why not use that as some of the prep then? Like I just, as ever with West Indies cricket, Santokie, the more they try to be transparent, the more you find like they're transparent, which they're to be applauded for, but they're not completely transparent. So it actually always tends to lead to more questions than the perceived answers that I suspect they think they're actually giving, right? And then I think let me just go to the squads, Santokie. Let's pivot to the squads because if I read Team Headley first, so Team Headley, Josh De Silva, Sunil Ambris, Darren Bravo, Justin Graves, Kavem Hodge, Chaim Holder, Akeem Jordan, Markino Mindley, Shane Mosley, Gudakesh Moti, Anderson Phillip, Kieran Powell, Tevin Walcott. Team Weeks, and that team's captained by Josh De Silva. Team Weeks, captain Ali Cathanes, Tej Chanderpaul, Casey Carty, Dominic Drakes, Jamar Hamilton, Brandon King, Jair McAllister, Zachary McCaskey, Vasami Permol, Raymond Reefer, Kevin Sinclair, Niall Smith, Devon Thomas. I'll leave the academy for a second. I'll come back to that. And it's just worth pointing out to people who don't know, Shea Hope was selected, but obviously is in England playing for Yorkshire, which he was given permission to do. And Rakeem Cornwall and Shane Dowrich made themselves unavailable for selection. At the time of recording, we know that Rakeem Cornwall is in Antigua playing in the cool and smooth T20. So we know why he made himself unavailable for selection. He wanted to go home and play some T20. We do not know at the time of recording why Shane Dowrich has made himself unavailable for selection. But again, we assume he would have been selected. Now, Santokie, to give them their due, most of the players that I had written down in my squad and when I did my video on who should be selected, most of them are actually there. Yeah. But there's a few names in there, Santokie, where I can't find a clear rationale to use to people to explain why they're there. But let me let you unpick it. Anything that stands out to you to some of those selections where you're left scratching your head?
I think the first thing to mention is obviously clear, following on from the A-team series against Bangladesh last year, that they obviously are grooming Josh De Silva to potentially be the long-term captain after Brathwaite stands down. I mean, we've always raised question marks about who sort of stood up as captain. Jermaine Blackwood's current vice-captain, but because of his age, you'd imagine he'd probably resign. He'd probably be out of the Test arena at a similar time as Brathwaite when Brathwaite steps down. So Josh De Silva, he's the right age, and they've obviously seen attributes in him which suggest that he could be a future leader. So that sort of indicates that. I think, as you said, to their credit, Cricket West Indies, the majority of this squad are what we'd expect based on performances in the regional season. I think the first one, which we've raised on social media, Chaim Holder got a pick as a spinner ahead of Brian Charles of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, Trinidad and Tobago, the local media is an uproar of that. Brian Charles has sort of been a stalwart in the regional side for the past few seasons. So that is a massive surprise to see him picked, him dropped instead of Chaim Holder. But genuinely, I think Team Headley, if I'm looking at Team Headley first, Mash, you know, you got Minley, Anderson Phillip, Moti, Kieran Powell, Sunil Ambris, Darren Bravo, experienced batters. I think there's no real, other than Chaim Holder, the question marks, I think in Team Headley at least, to get started with, there's no real question marks about players' selection. I think they've all sort of warranted selection. I don't know what your thoughts are, just looking at Team Headley first.
Yeah, everybody in Team Headley I had down to be selected other than Chameholder. Like you, I just assumed, given that Brian Charles was the incumbent in the A team squad and has been for a while, and given he was the 4th highest wicket taker in the championship, and if Rakeem Cornwall had turned down selection, you surely pivot to the next best off spinner. So I think there is a reasonable question to say, so how did Chameholder jump the queue ahead of Brian Charles? I think there was a reasonable argument to be made there. But everybody else in that team, I think you can understand why. Yes, some might say, how did Anderson Phillip get in? But we have to remember that Anderson Phillip is technically the next, because he's only because he got injured that he didn't play in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Otherwise, he would have been there. So I guess it's just their opportunity to get a proper look at Anderson Phillip and see what his fitness is saying and so on and so forth. So I don't have other than Chameholder, I don't really have any other major talking points or issues with Team Headley.
Yeah, and so if we move on to Team Weeks, Afanase again stood out as captain of Windward Islands, obviously star performer in the regional season. So they've obviously gone with him as a potential leadership candidate, looking forward to the West Indies A sides and long-term in the West Indies sides. But I think the interesting names, obviously, Mash, in Team Weeks is Brandon King and Dominic Jakes. Now, I know Dominic Jakes played I think the last 2 regional games, but he's predominantly been a white ball player so far. Brandon King didn't get to play in the regional season because of West Indies white ball commitments. Now, they're obviously looking at these players in terms of they're on the fringes of the test side. If they play this, they could potentially make the test side going forward. But this leads to what we talked about at the beginning, Mash. If Brandon King opens for Team Weeks against the West Indies Academy, hits a century, how credible are we taking that century, bearing in mind it will be against a team where most of the side are making their first-class debuts? So this is what I'm slightly confused about. If the press release is saying this is an opportunity for players on the fringes of the test side to kind of make a name for themselves, stake a claim for the test side, if the quality of opposition are players making their debut, youngsters, 19, 20, 21, how credible are the selectors and Cricket West Indies going to take that performances? Or does Brandon King need to perform in the final game, which is between Team Headley and Team Weeks? So that leads to question marks about the sort of credibility of this tournament in terms of looking ahead to test selections.
Yeah. What are we effectively saying to Brandon King, you've got 2 games to prove yourself? Or are we saying to Brandon King, listen, it don't really matter what you do, we're still going to pick you for the 18 tour? Because to be honest, Santokie, that would be my take. My thing would be, if there's an 18 tour, you just pick Brandon King regardless. And I don't know how much weight you can place by 2 games in this.
Is the 18 tour coming before the India tour?
Well, we don't even know. I'm just assuming it's coming before. Surely they're not going to do it at the same time as the India tour, right?
I would assume it was before as well, but then King will be in the World Cup qualifiers in Zimbabwe.
Oh my gosh, of course.
So they've given man 2 games, all or nothing.
Oh. Do you know what? I'd forgotten that. Okay, until we get official confirmation from Cricket West Indies when that 18 tour is, you would hope they would want it to be whilst IPL is going on. Because why would you not, right? Okay, no one, like, you don't have to care about TV viewing figures. It's an 18 tour, right? So everyone you pick isn't getting any kind of replacement deal in the IPL. So I don't see why you'd wait until IPL is finished to schedule an 18 tour. You can easily get it done in May. And say to Brandon King, go out for a couple games and fly to Zimbabwe for whenever the World Cup qualifiers take place, etc. Otherwise, if it's just about 2 games, then I'm with you, Santokie. What's it really teaching us? Other than that, though, what's your view on the Dominic Drakes one? Because Dominic Drakes played, I think, it may only have been 1 game in this first-class championship, right? Yeah. Let me go and look how many first-class games Dominic Drakes has played in his whole career. I bet it's no more than like 6 or something. Let me have a look.
It might even be less. I think he might have played. I think he played 1 in England last year.
He's played 3, Santokie.
So it was 1 this season in the Caribbean, 1 in England, and then 1 maybe like 4 or 5 years ago.
So what? So Dominic Drakes played the final first-class game in round 5 of the West Indies Championship. He he scored 22 against Leeward Islands. He scored 22 and 2 and took 3 for 38 and 1 for 32. Is it harsh of me? And I think Dominic Drakes is a talented cricketer, but how's he jumped the queue, Santokie? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with that. I get why Brandon King has jumped the queue because he has a first-class career and stats to support the idea that he can play red ball, and of course, he's part of the international side. What's the rationale for Dominic Drakes?
I mean, if I'm Abijal Mansingh and I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, hold on, like, why haven't I made this squad and the Dominic Drakes has made it? But I genuinely think Dominic Drakes has made it based on the fact that he was in the IPL last year. He's got that sort of star quality attached to his name simply by being a T20 player and being in the IPL. I genuinely think West Indies have thought, we can't be fussy. If Dominic Drakes is available, he's proven himself not proven himself, but he's performed in T20 cricket. Let's take a gamble and see if he is willing to play red ball cricket. Let's put him in this series.
Okay, so surely you know where I'm going from next then.
Go on.
If they're willing to look at Dominic Drakes and say, oh, well, he's clearly a talented youngster. We've seen him do bits and pieces around the world. Let's take a gamble on him. So why can't they do that for Pooran then? And Pooran's played more first-class games than him. So explain to me, Santokie, if they are willing to show that they've got some sense to just do a gamble on Dominic Drakes because they know he's got potential. Anybody who's listening to this conversation between us now, if they're nodding their head going, yeah, it makes sense, why then do people fight it down when we say the same thing for Pooran?
I guess the difference at Pooran, because he plays IPL and so much T20 cricket, because essentially this Tri-Series tournament, there's nothing to lose. You can just put anyone in it, basically. It's not a test match. Whereas Pooran's availability, I guess, is so different. There's not been an opportunity to throw him into a red ball game that has little consequence. That's my own take on it. But you're right. If the criteria is there for Drakes, I don't see what Nicholas Pooran, Evan Lewis, those guys what has the conversation been? Is there an opportunity for them to play some red ball cricket to try and get into the side? Because if Dominic Drakes performs in his 2 games, does that mean he's on the fringes of getting into the test side? Well, he'll definitely make that.
Thank you. That's my point. Santokie, Evan Lewis isn't in this year's IPL. In fact, knock me down, Evan Lewis has been playing red ball cricket in Trinidad this year, banging out centuries, banging out double hundreds, and so on and so forth. So if they were able to sound out Dominic Drakes and say, oh, you know what, Dominic, come through. How comes you can't bend it for other people then? I don't understand, Santokie. And this is what I'm saying about in being transparent and almost telling us what they're doing. They've also left themselves open to a level of critique, because I think it's right to say, if you can do it for Dominic Drakes, how comes you've been unable to do it for other people?
Do you think, controversial question, do you think Dominic Drakes being from Barbados has helped the fact that there's been more transparency in the conversations and him being given his platform?
Yes. yes. No, I do. And let's call it as we see it, right? I am not saying, boy, watch the comments light up when people listen to this. I am not saying that there is a Bayesian bias to selection. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, when you do picks like Chaim Holder and Dominic Drakes, which leave yourself open for people to reasonably say, well, hold on a minute, how did that happen? The natural pivot, because of the nature of the Caribbean and what we're so parochial about the cricket and the talk about insularity and this, that, and the other, you leave yourself open for people to go, so wait, is this a Bayesian thing? Because, and I'm not saying it is Santokie, but I'm saying they've left themselves open for people to put that charge to them.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think if you're putting the dots together, you've got Chaim Holder, Dominic Drakes being selected for this series. Obviously, the lead selector, Desmond Haynes, is Bayesian. If we're looking at it in contrast to the Trinidadian players, why has nobody asked, or why hasn't it been, as far as I've seen, not been asked, why do the Trinidadian players, Narayan, Lewis, Pooran, consistently play Trinidadian club cricket? But then they don't. There seems to be a separation in terms of playing for West Indies games or with the board. So there does seem to be a distinction between the Trinidadian players and some sort of separation. And I just feel, whilst we're not saying there is bias, if you're looking at the facts and evidence, it does lead to more questions which haven't been answered.
Listen, let's try and bring this one slowly to an end. Then let me ask you this. If that A-team tour to Bangladesh is before India, right? And let's just argument's sake say it begins in mid to late May and ends around early June before the World Cup qualifiers, etc. Let's take somebody like an Abhijay Mansingh, who I genuinely thought would be in this Headley versus Weeks series, right? Who do they call up to the A tour then, Santokie? Do they call up 14 players who aren't going to be playing Test cricket anytime soon, but would be almost like the B side, the players you would be looking at should there be gaps in the Test team? Or do they do what they've just done with Headley versus Weeks and say to like Tej Chandapur, Raymond Reefer, you know what? This is the only significant red ball prep we're going to get before a camp before India. Basically, you send what is effectively like a quasi Test team to Bangladesh. What would you do, Santokie?
I'd probably do that. I'd probably tell like a Tej Chandapur, Josh De Silva playing the A team, just because they're definitely going to be playing in the India Test. So any sort of red ball experience is going to benefit them. I think if you've got a Chandapur or Josh De Silva sitting out May, June, July before the India tests, they're not going to get that experience, and that's not going to be good for the Test side. So I would put a few Test players into that A side, but predominantly you want an A team tour to feature, those people who are on the fringes of the Test side. So I would like to see. I'd probably balance it out. 3 to 4 Test players who are exclusively red ball players. So, for instance, I wouldn't put a Craig Brathwaite in the A-team tour. I just don't think at this stage of his career. But, the younger players, De Silva, Tej Narayan, Chandapur, you'd put them in. And then have it with players who are on the fringes. So, Anderson, Phillip, Brandon King, if he performs, get him into that A side. And then just go from there. But I do think if you are picking an A-team side, players like Kieran Powell, Veersamy, Pamal, it's bearing in mind their age and the fact that their roles have sort of been filled, I wouldn't put them in the A-team side just because I don't think there's any path back for them to make the Test side. So you're predominantly looking at players longer term who can make that Test side. I'd put into the A-team tour. And also it'd be a good opportunity for someone like a Darren Bravo to see if he can score some more runs to capitalize on this season. So there's a few options, but to summarize, I would go with 3 to 4 Test players, but then the bulk of the squad, so 7 or 8 members of the squad, being guys who you're looking at to consider for the Test series.
That's an excellently put, and I was about to use that as a way to wrap the show, and then just as you were finishing, I suddenly remembered we didn't even talk about the one big talking point you and I spoke about as soon as the squads came out. Santokie, so where's Bonner?
Oh my days! I can't believe I forgot that.
We nearly ducked out of the episode without even talking about it.
Like free Bonner, where's Bonner?
let me set you up. So let me do the intro for this one, and then we will end the show. The last week now, for all we know, in fairness, I think Nkrumah Bonner picked up an injury in the last few rounds of the West Indies Championship, but here's my thing, Santokie. That's not being confirmed anywhere. I'm just telling you what I think has happened, right? But let's just place the story, Santokie. Nkrumah Bonner last year, we've spoken about it at length, up until his concussion in Australia, was probably, after Craig Brathwaite, our most kind of successful batter in the West Indies side in terms of accumulation of runs and showing an ability to play a Test match innings. Got licked down in Australia, got selected for Zimbabwe, got dropped for Raymond Reefer. Doesn't get selected for South Africa, gets told to go home and go play the Red Ball Championship, and Alec Athanaze gets called up to South Africa. Alec Athanaze doesn't play any cricket. Nkrumah Bonner comes back, plays 2 rounds of the Red Ball Championship, and in fairness, doesn't score runs. But here's my thing, Santokie. If you tell a man who's had two extremely successful, by West Indies standards, extremely successful years in West Indies cricket in 2021 and 2022, and you tell him after he gets dropped, and most people thinking, what's he being dropped for? This don't make no sense. And you tell him, oh, you've got to go make runs. How comes he's not in Headley versus Weeks then? If he's supposed to go make runs, why is he not in Headley versus Weeks? And let's just say, Santokie, if he is injured, because there may be a reason, how comes in the press release nobody said anything about Bonner to at least give some clarity on what's going on there? So my thing is this, Santokie. I think he's done now. I think his career is done out here.
Yeah, no, we've talked about this in the past. If Bonner doesn't play in the India series or get reselected, then his test career is probably most likely over because he'll be 35 by the time we play Australia in our next test series in January. Now, I agree with you. I think if he was injured, there would have been a footnote in the press release saying Nkrumah Bonner was selected, but however, injury prevented him from taking his spot. I think the fact that there is no update on his status means that for whatever reason he hasn't been selected. But if that is the case, if he was fit and not selected, it is mind-boggling because this Headley Week series was essentially set up for someone in Bonner's situation, told to score domestic runs. And I also think it was unfair on Bonner because he was told to make runs. Unfortunately for him, Jamaica's matches against the Windward Islands and Guyana were both at Providence, which is notoriously difficult for any batsman across the world to score runs on. So for him to have two matches to come back to on pitches which are famed for low scoring affairs, it was always going to be tough for him. So if he has not made the Headley Week side based on the performances in those two matches, I think it's a travesty, if I'm honest. I think regardless of what he scored, even if he went for 4 ducks in those two matches, the fact that he was in the test side up until the Zimbabwe series, was told to make runs, would warrant a place in the Headley Week side just to see if he can regain that form, that test match form. So I would like it, as with a lot of things, I would like more clarity, but I do think it would be a travesty if the reasons for his non-selection were based on form rather than an injury issue.
Fam, Dominic Drake's got in with 3 first-class matches. Dominic Drake's got in with 3 first-class matches. Nkrumah Bonner averages 38 in Test cricket, and we found no place for him in the
Let me ask you one more question. So, Shai Hope's obviously gone to Yorkshire. He hit 83 in the first match.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Even if Shai Hope didn't make any more runs, the fact he scored 83 in a county cricket game.
Oh, he's back in the Test team, bruv. He's back in. He's back in. Soon as I saw that 83, I was like, yeah, he's back in the Test team. That's enough. No, I'm being serious as well. That's all. He don't need to make any more runs. That he just straight back. When that Test squad is announced for India, he is back in that. He's back in the Test squad.
Man said he's the first name on the sheet. First name called out.
But it's gonna be interesting actually, because as much as I'm saying he's back in, what's going to be super interesting, and we can do later videos about this nearer the time. We know that middle order in the West Indies Test side is under huge scrutiny. Reefer, Blackwood, Chase, Mayers, right? Let's just say them 4. We know for a fact that provided he doesn't get injured, Ali Cathanes is number 1 pick. He's gonna get a go. Then you'd argue that Darren Bravo is in the conversation. And because of Shai Hope's 83, he's in the conversation. If Brandon King, say he licks down 2 centuries in this Headley Weeks thing, he's immediately in the conversation as well. So we could go into this India series, Santokie, where with wholesale changes, based on the fact that we know who are the people kind of waiting in the ranks to usurp those people within the middle order. So it'll be very interesting to see over the next few months.
Yeah, I think especially with the fact our next test assignments aren't until next year and they're away against Australia, Pakistan. I think if you are going to make changes, if you've seen long-term people who you think can fill those voids, like an Afanase, Brandon King, you put them in against India. home conditions.
Yeah.
First, only home test will play for the rest of the year. So I think you do put them in, and that you take the gamble and you make those changes against India. We don't want to be in a situation, you know, Tej Narayan Chanderpaul had to make his debut away against Australia. You don't want to be in a situation where you're having to bring in those changes in probably the toughest conditions you face in cricket away against Australia. So if they are going to make those changes, I'd rather see it sooner rather than later.
No doubt. Listen, people, this has gone a bit longer than we wanted it to do. So we're going to call that one to a close there. Obviously, at the time of recording, it will be Team Headley up first against the West Indies Academy in approximately, 12 hours? From the time, no, not 12 hours. Sorry, I was thinking that we're in Jamaica or something. It'll be in approximately like 18 hours or so at the time of recording. So lock in. It's on the usual channels, the West Indies YouTube channel, etc., etc. Just to remind you that Team Headley is the team captained by Josh Da Silva, and they'll be playing the academy side. I just realized I never actually told people who the academy side was. So very quickly, captained by Naeem Young, it is Kevlon Anderson, Akeem August, Joshua Bishop, Teddy Bishop, McKenny Clark. Santokie's just told me, so exclusive, that Rivaldo Clark is out and he's been replaced by Tevin Imlap. Joshua James, Johan Lane, Kurt McKenzie, Ashmead Ned, Kelvin Pittman, Keegan Simmons, Ramon Simmons, Kevin Wickham, and obviously I said at the start, the captain, Naeem Young. So do lock in, people. 3 games over the next effectively 2.5 weeks or so. And let us know your views on this particular video. Comments below if you listen to this on the audios, at us, Carib Cricket, etc. And lock in, people. Stay locked in, and you'll see more content from myself and Santokie over the forthcoming weeks. Last words to you, Santokie.
Yeah, and if you're on Twitter, if you're on social media and not already following us, drop us a follow, because we'll be updating continuously as these matches go on, starting from tomorrow, and we'll probably drop some more content in terms of videos, podcasts, once the first game has been finished. So it's been good, you know. I've been traveling the world for a bit, back again, cussing out West Indies cricket. It's always a good feeling, but no, good to be back. And as I said, stay locked for more content coming very, very soon on this channel.
Peace, people.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rule seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.